Okay, this is.
Hi, Danielle.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome.
And for the people who don't have that on, if you don't want that, if you don't want your audio and video on, great job. You're doing a great job with it. If you do want it on, say something in the chat and we can try to help you figure that out. Either way, it's fine. How do I? Oh, there I go. Okay. This will be interesting. I've never done anything like this before. So. Also, Father Daniel had a busy day today, or just a lot. I don't know exactly what he had going on, but he just texted me and said that he didn't know if he would be able to make it or not. So if he's here, awesome, if he can make it, and otherwise, it's gonna be me, which will be interesting because I didn't prepare the most notes for tonight since I, thought he was going to be doing it, so it's fine. Father Umberto's out of town right now, so I'm sure he's got a lot going on. Whoa. Hope everyone's doing all right out there in the lockdown. Nope, he will be here. Actually, he will be, took a nap, so he'll be here. I'll
be leaving at 7.
What?
I'll be leaving at 7, but I'm just a little observer anyway.
Gotcha. Yeah, totally fine. Oh. I really like this setup so far. I've tried a lot of different video conferencing softwares with all the family that I have in different locations, and this one so far is the least problematic. And
yeah, Zoom's awesome.
Yeah, this is really nice. A lot easier to manage. I swear every time we have a chat with, or like when I lived away and out of the state and I would have a chat with my family, you would always have to allot 15 minutes where you would just spend those 15 minutes trying yet again to figure out whether it was Google Hangout or Facebook Messenger or FaceTime or Snapchat video chat occasionally. And now the same thing happens with Ellis's family whenever we chat with them in Indiana. We spend a lot of time just trying to figure things out because we seem to re-forget how to use the software every time we decide to chat again. Gonna wait until Father Daniel comes online before I start things off.
Yeah.
If anyone was wondering, the Adoration Chapel is still open during this time. There are a new set of policies to try and help with the whole COVID-19 situation. You have to wash your hands before going in. You can't have more than 10 people in the Adoration Chapel at once. You have to sit 6 feet apart from each other. You can't sit right in front of a person, can't sit right in back of a person, and you have to have a key card to get in, and you have to enter from Emery Street. But in case anyone was wondering, it is still open, and if you have an hour there, please still go to your hour, because we're trying to keep it open during this whole time.
Yeah, we're pretty excited about the new precautions because we were there Tuesday, and like some people came in and sat immediately behind us. You know, there was like a sea of seats. We're like, okay, that's fine. And then more than 10 people were in there as well, but I didn't know who's, you know, I didn't want to be the one to be like, you gotta go.
Yeah, no, that's a hard position to be in. I'm kind of wondering how they are going to manage the whole only having 10 people in there at a time.
There was 11, and it quickly went back down to below 10. So I think next time, I'll just say something if I'm in there,
Like
or if I'm done, I'll just leave. You know, but
hey, Danielle, quick correction. It's entering on Collier, not Emery. On the Collier side is what I read.
Yeah. No, it is Collier. You're right. Because Emery, there is no real entrance on Emery.
Right. And then I think, Samantha, to your point, or maybe Danielle, you were saying you're not sure how they're going to monitor it. I was in there today and I had the same situation. I adore at 10 a.m. on Thursdays. And there was a family that came in that was a family of 6, and they all sat right behind me. But I do think with the new precautions, that the fact that you have to have a key card, I'm guessing will limit a lot of people from coming in.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Good, yeah.
Hopefully anyone who has lost their key cards, like my parents, goes and gets another one.
Yeah. Hopefully everybody's taking it a little more seriously too as time goes on. So hopefully it works itself out.
Okay. All right, so Father Daniel has joined us now. Hi, Father.
Hey, Father.
Hi, Father.
Hello.
So I'm gonna start us out, and then at a certain point hand it over to Father, and then I'll probably finish things up.
Yeah, great.
I need to make sure I didn't know I would have to be allowing people to come into this meeting, so I'll be watching for that too. But let's start with prayer. So in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Lord, please be with all of us during this time in our respective houses. We pray for all of those who are sick, or all of those who are suffering from anxiety or fear during this time. We pray for peace, for trust in you, and to let this time be a time of grace, filled with your love, and not a time of confusion and anxiety. Be with us tonight in our hearts and our minds. We ask this all in your name. Amen.
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 Okay. So the 6th and 9th commandments, we're going to be getting into morality involving sexuality tonight. And I want to kind of start us off and take us in the direction of talking a little bit on theology of the body. And I will give credit where credit is due. I listened to a podcast a couple weeks ago, and I'm still really excited about it just because I thought it said things in a really clear way. So a lot of my thoughts from that podcast are bleeding into tonight, but they're good and beneficial and helpful thoughts. So first point, I think, where it's important to start off with sexuality is to combat this Cartesian dualistic notion that we are souls driving around in little bodies, as if bodies are our cars. As Catholics, we're against that, right? We don't buy into that kind of dualism where we are a soul and we just sort of are in possession of a body. We are one being. So it's not like the body is just kind of this accessory that the soul has. We're more like an embodied soul or an ensouled body than body and soul. And that's really important to start with that, because we want to do away with any notion that the body is just this tool or this fun thing to mess around with, or like it's disposable. Interestingly, though we live in an increasingly secular and atheistic world, we also live in a society where more and more there's this modern notion that who we are truly is our souls, and the body is just kind of this accidental outer casing that we have. So despite the fact that we're getting progressively less religious, we've also seemingly really bought into this idea that who we really are at the core of our beings is this immaterial soul, and our bodies are just kind of an accident that we happen to have ended up with, and therefore it doesn't matter really what we do with them. They're just things to be used as we want to. Sexuality begins with the starting point of we are an ensouled body or an embodied soul. The body is an integral part of who we are as persons, and thus our sexuality is an integral part of who we are as persons. It's not an accident. It's a gift given to us by God that's very intentional. So we're created with intention, and not just our souls, but our bodies as well, and our sexuality. Our sexuality is not an afterthought or an accident. It's something that God gives to us very purposefully. So we can kind of have there's a lot of, sorry, I need to put this in again. There can be a confused notion that our sexuality is whatever we want to make of it, because it's a byproduct or an afterthought. But it's an integral part to who we are as persons. And then drawing on kind of my thoughts from a couple weeks ago, this does mean that there's a difference. So our sexuality, there's femininity, there's masculinity, and there is a real difference between the two. There's still equality between them. The difference does not mean that one sex is greater or lesser than another, but they are different in a complementary way, not antagonistically, so not different in the way that they repel each other, but different in the way that they complement and are made to come together. Marriage, marriage is an end of this complementarity and difference between the two sexualities. So you can think of, no, I don't want to. Okay, so in looking at differences between masculine sexuality, feminine sexuality, in Theology of the Body, which is not necessarily like a strict book, but it's kind of a way of thinking about sexuality, I would say, that was taught a lot by and written about and started really by Pope John Paul II. And he talks about masculine sexuality, you can kind of think of as this giving, and then feminine sexuality, femininity, representative of receptivity. And it's important to note that receptivity is often thought of today in the hyper masculinized world that we live in as a type of weakness, often equated with passivity. But that's really not how it should be thought of. Receptivity doesn't mean weakness. It is just as important as an act of giving, because you can't have a giver without a receiver. You can't have a receiver without a giver. They're equal in roles. It makes me think, we just had yesterday the Feast of the Annunciation, and Mary beautifully exemplifies this receptivity, so characteristic of femininity, in her fiat, so in her yes to God, in her allowing God to work in her life, and in giving up control, giving her life to God. And then the very real receptivity of receiving God incarnate into her womb. Yep. Receptivity also, in a logical way, almost has logical priority, because it describes the ultimate reality of humanity as receptive of Christ's creative gift of life. So this podcast I was listening to was talking about, receptivity being holding logical priority, because ultimately humanity as a whole has this role of being receptive to God, as Mary was. All of that to say, it's not to be confused with a type of weakness. I think there is a danger in hearing, masculinity, giver, femininity, receiver, and thinking the feminine has the weaker role, or somehow the more the only words I can think of are less good role. And that's not the case. They have an equality, because in order for both of them to fulfill those roles, there has to be the other. Each is necessary for the other. And in that way, it exemplifies the complementary differences between bisexuality. Sorry, I keep having to admit different people, and it distracts me momentarily. All right. In talking about chastity, the call to chastity, one thing I think that's really important to highlight with chastity is that it's different than abstinence. Not to say that abstinence is bad, but chastity is a much more fruitful way at looking at sexual morality as opposed to abstinence. Ellis and I have talked about this a lot in terms of how we teach sex education to young people, or just talk about sexuality to young people, especially in terms of morality. A lot of times there's this abstinence, and that's not a bad thing. It's good to talk about abstinence before marriage, but it's a small piece of a whole. Because with abstinence, really all you get is premarital sex, bad until marriage, and then nothing else. It's like sex is bad up until marriage, and then anything goes. Whereas chastity is a much more holistic way at looking at human sexuality and the sexual appetite, and saying it's not just about don't do it this bad. It's about our sexuality has a purpose. It was given to us with intent. and it's not accidental. Therefore, let's look at what that purpose is. Let's look at why we have our sexuality, what it's made for, and then let's live in accordance with our sexuality in the right way. So it's not just kind of this one note song. It's saying and examining our sexuality as a whole, not just prior to marriage and how we should be approaching our sexuality before marriage, but also after marriage, because you're still called to be chaste once you're married. And not only that, when you're talking about chastity as a whole, it doesn't just apply to married people. It applies to religious, it applies to priests, it applies to those living consecrated single life. So it's a much more holistic approach to sexual morality, and one that includes within it acknowledgement of the purpose of why we have sexuality and the gift that it is. It helps us say, no, sex is a beautiful thing, it's good, but it has a purpose, and in order to be respecting it and using it rightly, we need to know that purpose and then act in accordance with it. Father, if you want to take the next section, this is you.
Awesome. Great. Couple things before I dive into my part. I get the gross, icky part, but the awesome part as well is, firstly, if you want to write this down, I'm going to give you my parish cell phone number. And I know there's a way to talk on here and do stuff like that, but I also want to give you kind of an anonymous way if you want to ask a very specific question. What about this? What about that? I'm very comfortable with any of that, and no question bothers me. I have this policy with middle schoolers: every good question deserves an age-appropriate answer, and for you guys and your ages, everything's on the table. So that number really quickly is 720-600-4775. Again, that's 720-600-4775. And if like 2 or 3 of you could just text me, and that way I know that it's coming through. I have it up on my iPad, but I had to reconfigure my iPad. Maybe this is the everybody thinks somebody else is doing it principle. While I'm waiting for those texts, I think the next principle is also very important, which is sexuality is one of those things that has a lot of shame built around it. And that's not the angle we want to come at it with. The Latin word for wound is vulnus, and that's where we get the word vulnerable. And one of the most beautiful things about sexuality and the sexual embrace or the marital embrace is it requires someone to be vulnerable. Now, if you take that to its logical conclusion, that also means it needs to be woundable, right? Now, that doesn't mean wounded, right? That's not the goal of any form of sexuality, is for someone to be wounded. But vulnerable branches off in 2 ways. If it's done poorly, or if someone who's a moral agent, meaning they can make good choices or bad choices, if it goes in a negative way, right, that yields a wound. But if it goes in a positive way, it yields intimacy. And you can just see the church is very concerned with sexuality for a number of reasons, but sexuality is like this road, like a massive superhighway straight into somebody's personhood. So for example, if somebody, and I'll just get slightly graphic here, if someone were to suffer the act of rape, even gently, right, that would leave far more scars, that would leave behind far more wounds than someone just kind of randomly getting beat up in an alleyway. One is physical, but another is tied to somebody's person in such a deep way that it can really leave behind great difficulty, especially with wounding. Now, here's the other reality. I am a 32-year-old virgin. And so part of what I'm speaking about is not my own experience in terms of the sexual intimacy route, but I do have a deep amount of intimacy with a lot of people in the realm of the confessional. And that's where a lot of this stuff that we're about to talk about comes up, right? The people's misuse of sexuality or sexuality that falls short of the goal. And so the reason, it's essentially 2 sins, possibly 3, that have shame really caked around them. Sins of lust and then sins of stealing. Sins of stealing are sins whereby we put things over people, and sins of lust is where we put pleasure over people. And and since that's so anti who we are, ultimately, right? We're made to exist in community. We're made to exist in relationality. Whenever we put anything over other people or anything over God, it messes up who we are. And that's why one of the consequences is shame. So that's kind of my introduction. We'll go into some of the key points. Great. Okay. Good. I have, oh, nice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Thank you for all of you who did it. So it's up and running. That works well. Thank you. So if you guys have any questions at any point, I'll just be refreshing them. Let me cancel these out. Bing, bing, bing. Bing. Okay. Good. Yeah, so if you have any specific questions, you can do, I won't say who you are. That's the point of anonymity. Great, so going off the sheet that you guys have, sins against chastity. Now, chastity is a virtue. And if you think of virtue as a strength of character that allows you to wield your human powers in a good way. Anyone can pick up a sword. Anyone can pick up a sword and sling it around. But not anybody can wield a sword well, so that they're stabbing who they want to stab, so that they're protecting who they want to protect. And so you can think of the virtue of swordsmanship is what allows someone to wield the weapon of a sword, right? Chastity is what allows a human being to wield the, and not weapon, but the power of body and mind and soul. It allows someone to wield the power of sexuality. Now, there's one other caveat that I have to say here. And this is where it's really important that if you have questions, or if you think I'm saying something funny, ooh, Brett's coming in. If you think I'm saying something funny, then, or that sounds slightly different, go ahead and ask a question. When Danielle and I are saying sexuality, we're not talking about gay or straight. We're talking about the fact that we are sexual beings, right? That men have heightened testosterone and a penis and an ability to concentrate for only short amount of time. Just kidding. And women, right, have a vagina. They have, they're shaped differently, right? And not only the sexual organs, but the makeup of the nature of male and female is different. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about sexuality, male and female, but also the fact that we are sexual beings. There is, right, the Pope himself, since he's a man at the ripe old age of, I don't know, 80, whatever he is, the man has sexual urges, right? Father Daniel has sexual urges. Every human being over the age of, I don't know, 9 has sexual urges on some level or another, barring some kind of anomaly. So that's what we mean when we talk about sexuality. We will talk about homosexuality and heterosexuality. But when we say sexuality, we're not talking about sexual orientation. We're talking about the fact that we are created male and female, as Genesis says. Now the sun is fading, so I have to turn on a lamp. This is the perfect interlude for a question. And I don't know, Danielle, if you want to prompt me in any other way before we get into these. Nope, okay. So chastity, being this virtue of wielding the power of one's sexuality, there's kind of two levels of this. Chastity and continence. Continence is not falling to sin, right? It's simply making sure it doesn't happen. So that's everything from white knuckling. So let's say what often happens is, a guy goes off to college, he grows in his prayer life, he goes to confession for the first time since his first confession when he was 7 years old on a big retreat, and then he comes to grapple with how he's been living his life, and he's been sleeping around and drinking and watching porn since he was 11, and this describes about 70% of college guys out there. And then as he's growing in his moral life and trying to shed these sins of lust, he realizes that one sin is literally always within arm's reach: masturbation. Hold on. Okay, sorry, something else popped up. I need to turn my computer on Do Not Disturb. So, as I said, one sin always remains within arm's reach. That would be masturbation, right? He's always able to fake his body out into thinking he's having sex. And for most guys, this is a very common struggle because it's exciting, it's stress relieving, it's always there, it's almost always available when you're not in public. And so continence would be taking actions to just not do it, right? And so for some college guys, this is having a roommate in the same room, so that would be a little awkward, or never closing the door, stuff like that. And that would just be to make sure that he does not do the action of masturbation. And so continence is great, right? If you think about me as a priest, I better have continence in my life, because at some point, some beautiful woman's going to walk by and I'm going to fall in love, right? Or become aroused physiologically, right? And so if I don't have continence guarding me from doing something stupid, then I could get in serious trouble if the virtue of my chastity fails. So continence, again, it's not really a virtue, it's just kind of not doing it, right? Now, chastity, as with virtues, there's an ease, there's a promptness, and there's a delight. Those are three things that characteristically show the presence of a virtue. That someone can do something that's hard or arduous easily, with delight, and with promptness. So if you think about wielding a sword, only someone with swordsmanship can do that well and really take pleasure in it, or riding a horse, or playing volleyball, whatever. The rest of us can kind of mimic the actions, and we could get maybe a little certain part of an action of someone who has real swordsmanship. But it's not going to happen unless we actually have the virtue ourselves. Okay. So chastity is having the ease of not being tempted, but knowing what to do with the temptation. It is impossible, not necessarily impossible. It is not the thing to shoot for, to say, I need to be holy enough such that I am never tempted in this world. You're going to have to get rid of your body for that to happen, right? Plus, not being tempted is not the goal. The goal is to have strength enough of character to handle whatever comes our way. So, Father Daniel always wears his clerics when he goes out in public. Even when Father Daniel is meeting up with a married woman who he's known since he was 10 years old, and it's the two of them at Panera Bread, I always wear my clerics. One, for a visible thing, but two, so that if I were to somehow, succumb to making a move on a beautiful woman, like, people would know. Here's another principle to things with lust in the sixth commandment. As I said previously with sin is a choice, and sin happens first in the heart before it does in a physical action. And so the example I used a couple of weeks ago was if you go into a 7-Eleven intending to steal, I don't know, whatever, a granola bar, a lotto ticket, whatever, and you run into your second grade teacher and you strike up a conversation, and then you forget what you were there for, and then you left, you should still bring the sin of theft, even though you did not get to carry it out. You should still bring it to confession because you made the choice in the heart. Right? There's the chapter from I'm a Catholic priest, so I don't know where it is. Here we go. Matthew chapter 5, right? You have heard that it was said that you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, whoever looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so Jesus cuts right to the heart of the matter by making it very clear that sins of lust, yeah, sure, they happen bodily, but they can also happen interiorly, and any sin happens first inside. Okay, so back to Father Daniel. My chastity has to be well intact enough that when a beautiful woman comes up, I can say, wow, Lord, praise God for creating her. And then if I know that I'm going to be tempted to look twice, then I have the ease and joy and delight of looking away if I sense in my heart that I might lust after her. And if I then kind of later look back a second time and look at her butt, or cat call or do something misogynistic like that, right? Well, that's probably another sin on top of that, but rooted in lust, right? And so if I know that that's going to come about in my heart, it is my duty to wield my sexual power well through the virtue of chastity to direct myself in another way. And most of the time, men especially need to direct themselves in a different way as opposed to just put the brakes on stuff, because that doesn't really work, except for like cold showers. But something like cold showers in the heat of the moment is more in the realm of continence than chastity. Okay. To give you one last image on that, if you think of driving in the mountains, if you've ever driven Trail Ridge Road or Mount Evans or Independence Pass, one of those really amazing, beautiful drives, chastity is being able to stay within both lines almost seamlessly, the double yellow on the left and the white on the right. The virtue of chastity is meandering oneself well on the course of whatever road you're driving on, right? The guardrail to keep you from driving off the flipping mountain is continence. both should be employed, because no one should be so foolish as to believe that anyone's immune from any temptation whatsoever. But again, when we speak of continence, it's only as a fail-safe. Because the virtue of chastity will actually breathe a freshness into our soul. It'll breathe a sensitivity. The virtue of chastity allows one to go into the Louvre, see a whole bunch of bare breasts in paintings or sculptures, and be moved by the beauty and not be twisted in any which way that would seek for any kind of a grasping sexuality. Does that make sense? Now would be a perfect time for questions on that. I'm going to go into some of these things. So masturbation, it says, the deliberate stimulation of sexual organs for sexual pleasure, right? The way that I tell younger people what this is, and most of them already know, high school, sex is on the table. Middle school, we're very nuanced with how we talk about it. But to a high schooler above, masturbation is faking your body into thinking it's having sex. And if you think of sex as to be other-oriented, a gift of self for the good of the other, then there's a problem there. Especially for men, again, a lot of men come in with struggles of pornography and masturbation. And it starts off as something sexual, but then there are other components to it as well. There's a really good book called Wired for Intimacy, How Pornography Hijacks the Male Brain. And this book is written by a Christian, I don't think he's Catholic, psychologist who studies sexual acts. And he says that when a man reaches the point of ejaculation or orgasm, the amygdala in his brain, which is the size of an almond in the center of the brain, and it's the part of the brain that governs fear and anger. So the parasympathetic system of the body, the fight or flight mechanism, is running through this as well. And when a male reaches orgasm, not only does he have kind of a huge dopamine release, which is the pleasure chemical, but this amygdala, the center of fear and anxiety, and anger, resets. So you get about a 4-second lapse, and then the system resets. And so oftentimes when a man is seeking a release of that nature, he's actually seeking a stress relief. So sometimes men in particular, but women as well, can seek something out sexually, meaning exteriorly it's sexually, but interiorly it's not. And so a guy can be struggling with a sin of pornography or masturbation or both. And what he doesn't know he's trying to do is he's just trying to de-stress himself. Or he's bored and unengaged. Or, he has too many burdens upon him that he's not dealing with well. And so he might seek this out in a certain way that it's a huge stress relief. So masturbation falls way short of what sex is supposed to be. All of these bullet points are things that are sins because they miss the mark. Danielle, shake your head. Have we talked about sin as missing the mark? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah.
Hello.
We talked about sin being a striving towards goodness that fails or is perverted in some way.
Nice. Okay, great. So every human action belongs in some category whereby we as human beings are striving towards a goal or a telos or an end, right? To say it more simplistically, everything we do has a purpose. The fact that you have a pinky, there's a purpose with it. The fact that you have a nose, there's a purpose to it. The fact that you have a penis or a vagina, there's a purpose to it. And the purpose, there is no body part you have on your body whose primary purpose is entertainment. That's a line that I say for college students, but I think you understand what I'm saying. Is that the purpose of sexuality is to be guarded in the context of marriage, in which the couple enjoys an indissoluble bond. Husband and wife stay together, and in that they share the vulnerability, the intimacy, and the sacramental protection that is holy matrimony. And in that, they take off their clothes and enter into a naked embrace, which is good, awesome, and beautiful. I forgot to say this in the beginning. Oftentimes when I speak about sexuality, I am slightly more flippant than most other people out there. And I think part of that is because I've come to realize since being a priest that most people think I think sex is gross, but God only puts up with it for the sake of babies. But that's so not true. The Catholic Church holds sex in such high regard. And in fact, the reason I, as a Catholic priest, do not have sex is because my life is oriented towards a gift of self to God and to others. I could not stay up till 1 a.m. setting up all the live streams if I had a wife and kids and all this other stuff to take care of, or go to the hospital, or do all the other stuff. And so since my life is oriented towards intimacy with God and availability to his people, I do not enter into the sacrament of holy matrimony, and therefore, I do not enjoy some of its fruits, which are children and sex, and even the non-sexual intimacy that is the family life. But I just want to be very clear that the church is very pro-sex in the right context. Because you and I, at least we're of the generation that is statistically improbable that any of us are IVF children. You and I came from a mom and dad. You and I came from sex. Right? Another line that I love to use is Hugh Hefner, the inventor of Playboy, did not invent sex. God himself did. Sex is not gross. It's beautiful. And since sex is beautiful, any perversion of that beauty is ugly. That's why the Catholic Church is so guarding of this most precious of gifts. So masturbation would be the deliberate stimulation of the sexual organs, which is faking the body into thinking it's having sex. Fornication is sexual union of an unmarried man and unmarried woman. And so what that's doing, right? Externally, it's the same thing as if a husband and wife were to engage in the marital embrace. But what that's denying is that there's any kind of union of soul that happens. And since union of soul happens, it actually requires a certain protection, right? There's a part of the marital of nuptial blessing A that we use in the marriage rite that says, may he entrust his heart to her. And it speaks about their shared life together. But I preached about this a year and 3 months ago, of the entrustment of hearts to each other, and especially the entrustment of the man's, of his own heart to his wife. Right? Women are built for receptivity, as Danielle said. Yes, that's in the sexual organ of the vagina. Yes, that is in the fact that she has a womb and she has been chosen by God to bear life, to nurture it. And so, yes, it's built in the body, but it's also built into personality, right? Men try as best as they can not to acknowledge anyone in the bathroom. And yet women get up in these gaggles and in these hordes and go off together and do their lipstick and speak about boys and whatever. And you can just see it in the way that we relate to each other. A guy would so much rather punch another dude than talk about his feelings. If you look at cultures that are not imbued with technology or schedules like ours, the men go out and do these kind of burly tasks, and women gather around and do menial tasks. Important, but tedious. So like sewing or tying knots or shucking corn or blah, 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 and they gather in a circle and they talk and they nurse children and they do whatever else, right? That's nearly ubiquitous across time and geography. And so the receptivity that Danielle's talking about is also seen in just the personhood. So if you look at pornography, oh, sorry, I need to finish a thought on fornication. Women are receptive of the hearts of men especially. And there's a grace of protection that's prayed over the couple. And when they are married, and when they engage in the sexual embrace and the marital embrace, that marriage becomes indissoluble, meaning there is a union on the level of the soul so strong that it cannot be undone. And any kind of sexual activity outside of that union, protection, blessing, is playing with fire. Now, whenever we drive around, there are internal combustion engines in our cars. Fire helps us get where we need to go. Fire helps us keep warm. But fire in my living room carpet is not okay. Fire on my clothing is not okay. And so just like fire has its proper context, so too, sex has its proper context. And if we play with it, milk it out, or use it for anything like entertainment, which is the vast number of instances of fornication, although there are some kind of good-willed teenagers that really want to express their love and they're dealing with their hormones, but they're still doing so without the protection that happens on a spiritual level. Pornography is the removing of real or simulated acts from the intimacy of partners in order to intentionally display them to a third party. So it's a certain exhibitionism. That sexual intimacy is not to be put up for entertainment, either for the one who's engaging in it or for other people to watch as a third party. It's not a show. Right? We're horrified when we think of people hacking into baby monitors and seeing children as they sleep. And yet pornography is a really almost acceptable reality nowadays. Such a funny place we live in. Prostitution, I'm not sure I'm going to get a whole bunch of gigantic questions on this one, right? That you can't sell love, and sex is for love. Sex is for love, right? That's probably the other reason why each of these are on this list, because each of these on this list is falling short of the call to love and self-gift. Okay, Danielle, can you jump in here and reiterate something? I'm going to redo the lighting situation I'm currently in.
Okay. On pornography too, it's not simply a devaluing of sex and viewing sex as a form of entertainment or something to be consumed, but really consuming in a way the people themselves. When in the consumption of pornography, because you're viewing the people as objects. So it's treating their sexuality and them really in their entirety as a person, as an object to be consumed for one's own pleasure, instead of as an actual person, as an actual human being, which I think, a lot could be said about the connections between all that we have going on right now between the Me Too movement and the fact that we have a generation of young men who, many of which learned about sex from pornography. So learned about a lot of supposed ideas for what you should expect in sex, or certain narratives for how you're supposed to act with women from pornography. So why are there a bunch of women speaking out about being treated like objects or feeling dehumanized, or that their sexuality or personhood wasn't respected? I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there's a generation, multiple generations of men who learned a lot of their narratives in regards to interactions, sexual interactions with women, that saw women as objects or things to be consumed.
Nice. Great. Prostitution and rape. The last thing about pornography, John Paul II said the thing that's wrong with pornography is not that it shows too much, but the fact that it shows too little. That it reduces the human person to body parts, to, right, for women to be more appealing, they need larger breast sizes, or men need longer penises, or things like that, which has very little to do with actually the purpose and intent of sex, insofar as it's an exchange of love and in person in the context of intimacy and vulnerability, right? Good. So rape, forcible violation of sexual intimacy of another. Just, I think what that draws out is, and what the culture has picked up on is, without consent, you're not allowed to have sex, is what the secular culture would say. And great, Catholic Church is all for that. But without consent, there can't be love, right? That love is an act of the will. Will is tied to consent. And that's part of what makes self-gift a thing. And if you're really going to live in consent, then it's in perpetuity. It's, I give myself freely, fully, faithfully to you and forever, right? So I don't just give myself in a sexual way to you now and then to the neighbor down the street next week, right? Or when I get bored of you, or your body gets saggy 20 years from now, then I'm going to go after the secretary or whatever it is. But part of the beauty of the sexual embrace is it comes with I commit my life to you. Because what's one of the fruits of sex when lived properly? Children. And is there any age when a child reaches that age where parents stop being parents? No. Just parenthood looks different. Homosexuality, this is a really big one. I think a lot of us have people that we know, family members, friends, who are, we would call same-sex attracted. So there's kind of three terms that get thrown around: gay/gay pride, homosexual, and same-sex attraction. The Catholic Church shies away from the term gay, not because we just want a very clear message as to what we're saying. So we prefer the term same-sex attraction, which is someone who's attracted to the same sex. And the reason this is important is because gay tends to be synonymous with the gay lifestyle, which tends to be synonymous with sex, with having sex, right? So if somebody's heterosexual, that doesn't mean they're having sex. If somebody's homosexual, it doesn't necessarily mean they're having sex. But the way that gay can get used sometimes, and if you've ever seen photos of a gay pride parade, it's hard to detach that from specifically attempting to have sex. And so we prefer the terms someone, right? So someone who is gay or someone who is homosexual, we would say someone who has same-sex attraction. And the other reason this is really important is because having same-sex attraction is not a sin. Remember, sin is a choice. The Catholic Church is agnostic as to how same-sex attraction comes about. We don't care, actually, if it's a gene. We don't care if it's, you know, you got dropped on your left side when you were 2 years old and the earth was at this particular rotation, and then all of a sudden it just creates people with same-sex attraction. We don't care how it happens. We just care once it happens, how can someone live in the beauty of their life? Because we believe that any form of sex outside of marriage is going to fall short of the goal of marriage. And so being attracted to someone of the same sex is not by itself a sin in the slightest. It would be acting on that. So a man having sex with another man or having any kind of sexual contact with another man would fall short of anything close to marriage. Same thing with a woman to a woman. As we go through these, and it doesn't look like we're doing IVF or anything like that, but
it's at the very end.
Okay. What you're going to see is there's a unity of concept here. Anything that detaches two things from each other is going to fall into missing the mark on sexuality. That is this: procreation and union of spouses. The ability to bring forth life and the ability to come together. And so masturbation certainly does that because there is no other. It's just the self. Lust in the heart does that because there's no vulnerability. You're just taking somebody else and replaying whatever images in your head that you'd like. Right? Fornication, there is no specific commitment to the relationship in the long term. And it does not acknowledge the necessity of God in that which is supposed to be one of the most important relationships. If you're having sex with the person, it should be one of the most important relationships, and you should bring God in the midst of that relationship. Right? Pornography, you're a third party to whatever act is going on through pixels, but ones and zeros cannot transmit intimacy, cannot transmit the acceptance that's needed to enter into the marital embrace, and cannot give an outlet to be received, right? Even for men, to enter in the sexual embrace, you need to be received by another. There's another point that's really important to make, and it's this. When a couple enters into sex, into the marital embrace, and they do so in the context of their relationship, and they do so in the context of everything else that they're living, right? Sharing chores together, raising children, all that kind of stuff. Sex is going to be one of the top 5 holiest things that they do as a couple. It'll be right up there with attending Mass. It'll be right up there with praying the rosary as a family. It'll be right up there with one's relationship with God. If one is bringing their sexual relationship to God, if husband and wife are praying together, if husband and wife are loving each other outside of the physicality of it, then the sexual embrace will be a sacramental which conveys grace. Sex will be a sacramental tied to the sacrament of holy matrimony, and it will bring grace. That's why everything that falls short of it is just, it brings ugliness to sex. Homosexuality, therefore, has no possibility of procreation. Now, yes, you can grab a sperm donor and you can grab a surrogate womb and you can, copy and paste biology as much as you want. However, It's obvious that somebody's going through backflips to make it happen. And it's obvious that procreation and union of spouses is not happening that way. If you do know someone who has same-sex attraction, and you're really stuck with how to speak to them about it with the church, there's a really great 40-minute documentary-ish, film-ish. It's called The Third Way. The Third Way. And it's on YouTube and it's free. And it's the Catholic Church's response to how to talk about this. The first way is there's an opening scene from the Westboro Baptist Church of people who are bigoted and people who hate. These are the people who killed Matthew Shepard in Wyoming 20 years ago. And these are the people who will use derogatory terms for persons with same-sex attraction. This is not what the Catholic Church is for in the slightest. The second way would be do whatever you want, as long as it makes you happy, love is love, all this kind of stuff. And it would be what we would call the gay culture. And so one is kind of a beating down, the other is a do whatever makes you happy, do whatever without any real consideration as to the meaning of sexuality. But the third way would be essentially the call of someone with same-sex attraction would be the same call as me, a priest. It would be a call to a life of celibacy. That if someone has no orientation, an attraction, a sexual attraction to someone of the opposite sex, and therefore is either disinterested or unable or unwilling to procreate and to enter into that marital embrace, then if that person would wish to live the Catholic faith, they would take up my post as well, not as a priest, but in giving one's life over to celibacy, to the refraining of use of one's sexuality, which not a lot of people like hearing that. But I know 3 guys and 1 girl who are in this boat. And it took a few years of struggle. But they knew that they were more devoted to Jesus and his church than to their own cause of whatever it is. And so they said, whatever, I'm not sure I agree with it, but I'm going to at least begin to live it out. And then after living it out, some of them have found really delightful freedom in the midst of it. You can ask me any questions about that as we go on. I think, Danielle, are those my sections?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Great. So I'll stick around till 8. I'm sure something else will hit me, as it normally does.
On a last note involving homosexuality, it is interesting kind of the instinct that people have in responding to people with same-sex attraction, because we definitely don't have the same instinct in terms of other desires. So we don't say anything you desire, like if you desire it, it is therefore a good thing. As long as you have that desire, therefore that which you desire must be good. We don't say that with other things. We don't say that with food or material things or but when it comes to a desire marked by saying I love it, or there's an emotional passion for it that is labeled as love, there's a different reception to that type of desire. I don't really have an answer to exactly what marks that differentiation, except that maybe we're very much a culture that says, love conquers all. If you have this emotional feeling of love, then no matter what, it must be a pure and glorious and good thing. Maybe it comes from that. But we definitely put that type of desire in a different category than other ones and treat it as if it could do no wrong, which is not true. Okay. Yeah, really the rest of this does talk about the second, that fecundity and fruitfulness aspect of marriage. So with that unitive concept, we always say fidelity with fecundity, or union with fruitfulness, the two purposes of marriage, the union of the spouses and growing in love, growing in fidelity with each other, and then also procreation. So having that new creation of life within the family that raises it to a certain level of dignity because it brings in that creative aspect of God into the marriage, and also creates that kind of reflection of the Trinity that we see within marriage. Because of this second aspect, procreation, things like birth control and IVF are things that the church is against. When we talked about morality and moral action theory a couple weeks ago, we talked about the intent, the object, and the circumstances of an action all being involved in understanding its morality and determining if it's a moral or immoral action. And that, I think, helps to understand why the church is against artificial forms of birth control. Because a lot of people can say, well, what's the difference between things like natural family planning, which is fine by the church, whereby a couple uses natural periods of infertility to space out children. What's the difference between that and artificial birth control? Because in both, let's be generous here and say there's just, with both couples, a desire to space out children. So it's not even just that the people using artificial birth control really don't want children at all, and they think they're a burden. It's not that. They just want to space them out more for timing's sake. What's the difference between that and natural family planning? Because the intent seems similar. And the intent can be similar, but remember there are two other aspects that are important in determining the morality of an action: the object and the circumstances. So if a couple doing NFP, natural family planning, and a couple on artificial birth control have sex, that's the object, they're having the marital embrace, that would be similar too. But then where they become different is in the circumstances, because in the circumstances of the couple using NFP, there is no human action changing the nature of that marital embrace. There's no external there's no external circumstances of any sort whereby that couple has, through their own actions, impeded the procreative aspect of sex. There's nothing that they did to the act to change it. Whereas with a couple using artificial birth control, whether that means a pill, whether that means a condom, or an IUD, there are circumstances whereby the couple has actively done something to change the act so that procreation is not possible. So it's a difference in acting in accordance with how would I say this?
One of the ways I put it is that with NFP, you're cooperating with what God has given us. God has given us natural cycles of fertility, and you're just merely cooperating with what God has created, as opposed to chemically intervening and, forcing, if you will, infertility chemically.
Yeah, I like that. Cooperating is a good word, as opposed to actively taking an action and having an external circumstance that impedes any kind of cooperation. And that changes the moral nature of that action because you've actively done something to the act to remove procreation from the table. With IVF, it's kind of the opposite because it's a couple striving, they want to have children. And infertility is definitely a really difficult struggle. I feel like I all of a sudden got engaged and marriage was something that I regularly talked about and kids in the future was something I regularly talked about. And all of a sudden it was like everyone was telling me about their friends who were struggling with infertility, or the couple that they knew that had been trying for 3 years and was so desperate. So I don't know if that's always been around like that, or maybe something's happening in our environment to make it so that more couples struggle with it. But I definitely feel like I've come to realize more and be more empathetic to couples who are struggling with that, because that would be extremely difficult. However, the church does not believe that children are a right. So just because a couple gets married, just because a couple lives a good and holy life, that does not mean you're ever owed children. They're always a free gift from God that is given freely, not because you're owed it or because you have a right to children. So you can't just do anything for the sake of conceiving and having a child. And again, that unitive aspect, having the two dual ends of marriage, procreation and union, that comes into play when we're looking at IVF or other methods of conceiving that are, because there's so many now, that disrupt that twofold purpose. So if you take conception outside of the marital act, you're taking away the purpose of union. So there's issues there. And then with IVF too, you have the added difficulty of the fact that when a couple's going through IVF, they create multiple embryos and then kind of insert them into the woman's womb many at a time just to hope and see if one sticks or two stick. So there's a kind of, and I talked about this last week in the lecture I recorded, there's a kind of disregard for the sacredness of human life there, because you're being careless with creating all these new embryos, new lives with souls, and then either purposefully disposing of them or maybe putting them on ice for an indefinite amount of time, or inserting a good number into the woman's womb, knowing full well that many of them won't survive. So for that reason, we're against IVF. There's so many different forms now of artificial insemination that I feel like I'm missing one that I wanted to talk about, but in all those kind of range of situations, as a general rule of thumb, you can apply the principle of, is it retaining the sacredness of the dual purposes of procreation and union, and retaining the sacredness of the marital embrace. So it's not taking the creation of life, something that's very beautiful and sacred and reserved to the way God deigned for life to be created. So sex, it's reserved to sex. Is it taking that and divorcing it from sex such that it becomes something that's sort of cold and scientific and a little too much in human hands? Turn my computer on. Oh, going back to NFP, I started when I was talking about the difference between a couple using NFP and a couple using artificial birth control and said, going to be generous, and we say that they're both using it just to space out children. That's an okay intent. What if the couple using NFP was using NFP with the express purpose of never having children? That would get into dicier territory. Now, there are exceptions if you're permanently avoiding because the mother has some kind of condition whereby if she conceived, there would be a danger to her life, or maybe even the life of the child would always. I'm not positive on that one though, so I don't want to speak on it. But if it was a danger to the woman's life, then that's permissible. But if a couple is using NFP with the express intent of never conceiving children because they entered into marriage never wanting children, or even if they entered into marriage desiring children but then later decided, no, we love our life just as it is, we're going to decide to purposefully never have kids, then that's an issue. So just because you're using NFP doesn't mean 100% you can't be doing anything morally wrong, because you could have, as Father Daniel said, a sin of the heart that's there in a kind of selfishness or unwillingness to be open to new life. Offenses against the dignity of marriage. So just briefly, because I think most of these we've touched on a lot with talking about the sacrament of marriage. Adultery refers to marital infidelity. It's sex outside of marriage, so we've kind of covered that. Divorce. Divorce is, one, not something truly recognized by the church, because even if you got a civil divorce, that does not mean your marriage is dissolved. If you are married within the church, if you are in a valid marriage, that union is there until death do us part. So if you get a divorce and then get remarried, your first marriage is not gone. So that's why divorce and then remarriage ends up in a state of adultery. But also the actual action of divorce itself. If you're in a Catholic marriage, you divorce someone, that can be wrong unless you have legitimate grounds to. So if there's real abuse going on in the marriage, or it's an environment that's harmful to children or to yourself, then it's permissible. The same with separation. I kind of think we've covered all of this other stuff in what we talked about earlier and everything we've discussed before. Rick, do you have any other thoughts or anything that you're seeing that you feel like we missed?
No, I mean, typically I take the topic of marriage that happened, I think, back in February, and I was out of town. So I'm not sure how much you talked about annulments and the difference between annulments and divorce. Again, divorce is purportedly breaking that bond. And while it can be permissible from a civil standpoint, if there is a very difficult relationship and you need the civil authorities to help separate property, etc., but the Catholic Church views that marriage as still valid and still a covenant relationship. And, we talked about covenants very early on, and covenants are only breakable by death. And then a lot of people will say, well, what about annulments. Isn't that just a Catholic divorce? Well, an annulment is, taking a look at when that covenant was established and was that truly a valid sacrament at that point. And so if it's found that it wasn't, then it never existed. That marriage never really existed in a sacramental form. So that's kind of the difference. And one of the big things is free will. If one of the spouses was hiding a whole secret life from the other spouse, did that other spouse truly have free will in engaging in that covenant, right? There's other reasons that when the tribunal goes back and looks at that sacrament to determine if it actually did exist or not. So that's one of the key differences there.
Did we have any questions, Father? Okay, then actually I'm going to get back to one other thing that I was thinking of earlier when we were talking about consent and the difficulty with consent and maybe a role marriage plays in that. I took a class in graduate school on epistemology, so the science of how you know, or the study of how you know things. And we got into this really interesting seminar talking about consent and how do you know when you know enough for consent. And I thought it was really interesting when you brought that into the realm of sexuality, casual sexual hookups, and everything, that's been going on, especially, again, as I say, with the Me Too movement. I feel like I've been very around that, obviously, because it kind of began and gained strength when I was in undergrad, and then being in college during the time that I was, just knew a lot of people coming out with a lot of stories. And this idea of consent and casual sexual hookups, what do you need to know to be able to give your consent to someone in something as deeply intimate and vulnerable as a sexual encounter? And is it actually possible with casual sex? Because you can have known unknowns, so things that you know that you don't know about the person, like you maybe don't know where they're from or their favorite color, but you can also have things that you don't even know that you don't know. So unknown unknowns, like you aren't even aware that you don't know about their criminal past, or you aren't even aware that you don't know that they have a girlfriend in another town or something like that. And so with these known unknowns and unknown unknowns, is it even possible to ever give consent? What kind of knowledge threshold do you have to pass to be able to give this consent? And I thought it was really interesting. I wrote a paper on it just about casual hookups, but really you can expand that to any kind of sex outside of marriage. And marriage is this unique, or it struck me as an interesting, unique solution to this problem of how can we ever know enough to give consent? How can we ever be sure that we want to give consent to this person? Marriage is this unique solution where you say, I maybe don't know everything about you, but I am making this vow to give consent permanently, faithfully, fully, full, total, faithful, fruitful, forever. So it's almost this acknowledgement that you might not know everything, but you are going to kind of take that leap and make that vow and give that permanent consent. So that's my slightly off topic, but hopefully slightly interesting thought involving consent and sex and everything like that. I find it very interesting.
Thanks. I have one question that came in. So the question says, are we not allowed to have sex with our spouse if the spouse is physically incapable of having children due to a hysterectomy? So we can widen this to a whole number of things. So plenty of people are not born, but are enter into marriage infertile for whatever reason, right? And they are not. They're perfectly fine having sex. So in the moral realm, they still have to have the same kind of sex as would be fitting for procreation, right? So I didn't get into the nitty gritty, but like husband and wife who are engaging in mutual masturbation or oral sex is doing so outside of the parameters that the Catholic Church has drawn for the safety of sex, for sex that's a type of sex that's always an act of giving and not an act of entertainment, right? Or just for mere pleasure, right? And so the possibility of having children is always that safeguard, but menopausal, a couple where the wife is in menopause, they're not having sex, they're not sinning if they have sex. If someone had a hysterectomy, they likely did not do so to make her infertile, right? And so that would not be a sin. They're probably treating something else, and it has this dual effect of rendering her infertile, right? Now, there is tubal ligation and, I forgot the male version of it, but snipping his vas deferens, which would be an act that's specifically intending to remove the ability to procreate, right? And that would certainly need to be repented of. When that comes up in the confession, I do encourage the man or woman to look into what would a reversal look like. It's not mandated by the Catholic Church that you need to reverse in order to be able to make love to your husband or wife. But it is an act of heroic generosity in the wake of repentance of someone entering into that sin of self-sterilization, of removing the ability for procreation. There was one other, and then a couple that's dealing with infertility for whatever reason. I always recommend, and this is not morally required, but I always recommend that they would pattern out as if she were fertile and live as if they were doing NFP, which means somewhere between 7 and 14, 15 days a month, not engaging in sexual intimacy, which would be patterned off of a couple that would be living NFP. And the reason and the beauty for that is it forces the relationship to seek other modes, to have physical, non-sexual forms of love, which most couples are like, what does that even mean? And you're like, hello, like holding her hand, right? I can see Rick laughing. Good thing he's muted, but right? I mean, like, guys, we're so physical, but like, when have we, well, not we, but when have you, right? When do guys really put the physical pleasure, the non-sexual physical pleasure of their spouses at the forefront of their mind, right? It's just a really beautiful thing. And so if a couple who is really fertile, they need to be really good about, and they're living NFP, these couples joke with each other, and they'll joke with me. I mean, it's kind of funny about that they're in their fertile time, and so they're not engaging in the marital embrace, which is forcing them to seek out each other's heart in a different way, to seek out each other's body in a different way. And actually, the couples that live this end up having happier and more pleasurable sex later into their life, whereas all the couples that were having sex years before they got married, and then they just kind of don't know how to continue it past year 8 of their marriage, and their marital satisfaction is just so low, right? Versus the couples that lived temperance, that lived chastity, that knew how to wield their sexuality well, they will wield it until one is kneeling at the deathbed of the other. And that will be one of the fruits of the beauty of their sexual gift to each other. And so it's not just like, don't do it, otherwise you're ticking off Jesus, right? It's all of this has everything to do with your shared life together. Because ultimately, you are called by God to accompany your spouse into death. And then your spouse will meet you on the other side and will be praying for you from the heights of heaven until you at last meet again. And sex has everything to do with that. And that's why the church makes it her business to preach the good news of human sexuality. The church is not against anything at all. We are only for the highest goods of things, not shadows of goods. And with that, I rest my case.
Awesome. Well, I need to go feed a tiny human. So let's end with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, thank you for this time together. Please be with us all during this very weird, unprecedented time. Help us to grow closer in all of our relationships, especially our relationship with you. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. All right, I think this worked pretty well, so I'm excited to do this next week. Thank you, Father, for your guest appearance. I took notes on how to do this next year.
Great.
All right, bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.